Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today's episode of Legal Tea is a cautionary tale, a real-life case with real-life clients and real-life facts, though their names, of course, are altered for confidentiality purposes. So I see no better time to talk about the topic of blended families than the week of Thanksgiving, where y'all may be getting around the same dinner table soon. Maybe this is the worst idea ever to talk about blended families on a week like this, but oh well, here we are. If you stop listening for whatever reason and you never ever come back to this episode, here's the big takeaway from this episode. Hear me loud and clear. If you are a part of a blended family, please get your estate plan done. And newsflash, estate planning for blended families, it can be done. I promise, it can be done, but it requires so much attention to detail. It requires someone like me that has a deep understanding of estate law and honestly a willingness on your part to possibly have some difficult conversations. But if you're still listening, let's dive into the juice. Recently, I've heard my husband, who, in case you're tuning into the podcast without listening to prior episodes, my husband Justin is an estate and elder law attorney too, and we're at the same law firm. So I've heard Justin talk about two cases recently that one involved blended families, and two, said blended families better be glad we don't do hourly billing. So we're going to chat about both situations, actually. First, so here's situation number one. We're going to talk about the Johnsons. Oh, the Johnsons. Where to even start with them? Justin initially met with Mrs. Johnson only. And she shared that Mr. Johnson's health had declined and she was interested in how she could get their assets protected. A fairly extensive but solid game plan was put together, and it involved utilizing an asset protection trust and getting Mr. Johnson qualified for Medicaid. Because of Mr. Johnson's existing documents, it forced Mrs. Johnson to have to work with Mr. Johnson's child. So keep in mind, we're talking about blended families here. So this was Mr. Johnson's child, not hers, not Mrs. Johnson's. They had their own respective children, but they had no children together. It was discovered through the process that there was a fair amount of distrust between Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Johnson's child, which honestly made the process much more difficult. You see, prior to utilizing our law firm, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson had each created a revocable living trust, meaning it was not a joint trust, they each had one. Because one, revocable living trusts offer no asset protection against Medicaid, and two, Medicaid does not care if you and your spouse hold things individually and not jointly, we had to combine their assets as part of this game plan. Mr. Johnson's child was squeamish about this idea, and rightfully so. He didn't want to join assets with his mother-in-law, Mrs. Johnson. But to get Mr. Johnson on Medicaid, we had to. I mean, you could literally feel the distrust between the two. And at times, I'm just so sure Justin felt like more of a mediator rather than an estate and elder law attorney. Actually, I know he did. So for that reason, he had Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Johnson's child execute a promissory note that basically said, hey, when we're through this Medicaid process and on the other side, Mrs. Johnson has to kind of, quote, pay Mr. Johnson's part back to bring it back even. And both signed. Thank goodness. You know, sometimes things go awry. and they do so completely out of everyone's control. Unfortunately, Mr. Johnson ended up passing away shortly after Medicaid was filed for. Subsequently, he did get approved, but I digress. At this point, Mrs. Johnson needs to get Mr. Johnson's share back to Mr. Johnson's kid. We honestly knew she would. She wasn't evil, but she definitely started to nickel and dime to be able to keep some of Mr. Johnson's money that originally they had never commingled, but she was wanting to keep some. Like she had said that she had purchased a chair for Mr. Johnson so that she should get reimbursed for that. Yeah. After so many conversations between Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Johnson's child, Mrs. Johnson finally, after many reminders, paid Mr. Johnson's child back, and all ended up fine and dandy. I was not part of this case. I never dealt with Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Johnson's child, no one from the families. But I can assure you that I saw the literal wear and tear of my husband. It was a lot of work. Trust me. Thankfully for the family, they had an awesome estate and elder law attorney working alongside them. Someone like Justin, someone like me, an attorney skilled in the estate and elder law field. We're uniquely equipped and trained to approach a situation based on facts, not emotions, and develop and execute a plan in the best interest of the client. And I get it. Emotions are real. They're very, very real. And they are honestly quite prevalent with blended families, especially when money is on the table. So for all my blended families out there, when it is I just messed up my own hashtag. When it is time to #do your estate plan, please ensure you work with a qualified estate and elder law attorney. We're just used to these sort of things. Okay, now let's shift to the second situation, the second story I have for you on the blended families topic. Okay, so this next family involved a dad, a stepmom, and son of the dad. Hence why I say stepmom. So let's name dad and stepmom. They're going to be Chuck and Nancy. And we're going to name dad's son Ron. So we got Chuck and Nancy, dad and stepmom, son Ron. So Chuck and Nancy had some sound legal advice because, long story short, Chuck had some farmland that was his family's farm and had passed down through his family's generations. Chuck had, within his estate plan, created a standby trust for Nancy that essentially stated, hey, if Chuck passes before Nancy, the farmland goes into a farm trust where Nancy is not the owner of the farmland, but while Nancy is living, she's entitled to the income that the farmland generates. And then, at Nancy's passing, the farmland leaves the farm trust and is distributed to Ron, so Chuck's son, not Nancy. Chuck passes away, the farmland goes into this farm trust, and Nancy starts getting the income. So we're at a point, Chuck has passed away, and everything is beautifully going according to plan. Well, we got some brake tapping. Nancy has a friend at church that's an attorney, and that attorney thinks she's getting ripped off because the income should be more than it is. So guess what? Nancy hires this attorney to represent her. Lord have mercy. So Ron, Chuck's son, contacted Justin, my husband, for his opinion. Justin had helped Ron with his own estate planning. So Ron trusted Justin's opinion and input. You see, Justin is like the nicest guy ever. He's just nice and patient and gentle. So he told Ron, I'll try to get things settled down. Let me see if I can talk to Nancy's attorney, explain what your father was intending to do, explain that the farmer farming the land is on contract for the cash rent amount. Just kind of sort of wave the flag like we're not trying to have a big old fight here. Did Justin have to do that? Absolutely no. But did Justin even accept a penny to help Ron? Still no. He was truly just trying to help and just trying to keep things calm for Ron. So after a conversation with the attorney, Justin talked with Ron about, hey, what if we throw her a chunk of change? What it would be if she had survived 20 more years. So Nancy was already 80 years old. So Justin was proposing that Ron kind of pay her off for, let's say, 20 years of cash rent, and maybe she'd be agreeable to taking the money and extinguishing the trust. So just kind of, stewing on some ideas here. Well, Nancy's church friend, that's an attorney, was not playing around, and he just said nope. And side note, part of me wonders if he even discussed these things with Nancy, because according to Ron, Nancy was super nice and respectful and agreeable to things before this church friend got into the picture. Anyway, so at this point, Justin waved the white flag. Clearly, this guy is wanting to push the issue, and Justin and me and our firm, we don't do estate litigation, thankfully. So Justin laid the bad news on Ron and ultimately referred Ron to an estate litigator to kind of play hardball with Nancy's attorney. And as I write this episode, this case has not been resolved to my knowledge. I believe it is still going on, sadly. This reminds me so much of something I tell clients all the time. Even though I only practice estate and elder law, routinely I will get asked a legal question out of left field. And people will say, "Oh, you're a lawyer. Now, can I get sued if..." And I'll stop them. And abruptly, I'll say yes. And here's something else everyone needs to hear loud and clear. Anyone can sue anyone at any time for anything. And guess what? There's a good chance they'll find an attorney at least willing to take the case. Read, pat a bill. So perhaps the lesson to learn from Chuck, Nancy, and Ron is that even when a solid plan is created, sometimes crazy things still happen. Chuck did the absolute best thing he could do. He wanted to provide for his wife, Nancy, but he wanted to keep the farm and the family too. So he created a very, very good plan. And there's a very good chance his plan will hold up. But now, Nancy and Ron's relationship was probably going to be donezo. And two, now they're both paying lawyers. Dare I say, unnecessarily. Now, lastly, before I wind things up on this story, I must say that regardless of what happens to Chuck's grand plan, he put his wife and family at least in a position to succeed. And if they choose to crash his plan, that's a shame. Can you imagine, though, if Chuck had done no planning at all? It would perhaps be even a bigger mess, and his intention of keeping the farm and the family probably would not have carried out. It would not even have a fighting chance to carry out. So at the very least, let that be a final takeaway from this story. A plan is better than no plan. I was giving a presentation recently, and an attendee at the presentation asked me, "Hey Jenny, my mom and dad are divorced. My dad remarried, and I want to chat with him about this estate stuff, but I don't know how." And she said, "I'll be seeing him soon at the holidays." And she kind of left it as a cliffhanger, kind of almost insinuating that maybe she'd chat with her dad at an upcoming get-together. And, every family is different. Some are super open and comfortable talking about this sort of stuff. But I would say most blended families aren't. It's that elephant in the room, right? And it's not in a bad way. It's just they don't talk about this stuff. So I encouraged that attendee at the presentation to set up a time just for her and her dad to grab coffee, grab dinner, or something to bring it up. So especially since she's part of this blended family, I wanted her to start this conversation privately and see where it goes from there. And that's just my 2 cents. Alrighty, enough with this craziness. As we approach Thursday being Thanksgiving, I hope you all take a moment to reflect on what you're grateful for and thankful for. And for those that have lost loved ones who are normally at the table, you're not alone, and many are thinking about you and your family. And for those that still have a table filled with family members, just remember to embrace the moment. It won't be like that forever. So put the squabbles aside and just enjoy the time with your family and friends. Promise? Okay, so next week's topic is a current event, a current trend, something I've seen or run across that I think would be super interesting on this Legal Tea podcast. So yeah, we'll be talking about something current next time. I stumbled upon a story in the New York Times about a body that was donated to medical science, and it kind of went bad. It kind of went wrong. So yeah, until then, Legal Tea listeners, be well, and I hope you all have a very happy Thanksgiving. And remember, the most important thing to remember about Thanksgiving, to wear your stretchy pants. Take care.